According to the FBI, at any given time, there's 25 to 50 serial killers currently operating in the United States. Cool! Sleep tight, kids. We also have the highest number of serial killers per capita in the whole world.
USA! USA! USA!
A serial killer is defined by the FBI as somebody who kills more than 3 people over the span of more than a month, with emotional cooling off periods in between. But the general popular version of what a serial killer is somebody who basically gets off on hurting and inflicting pain on other people. And while we think of serial killers as a fairly, modern phenomenon, there's always been a small percentage of the population that has no empathy and gets pleasure out of seeing other people suffering. I mean, somebody's got to work the phones at Comcast customer support. But we've always been fascinated by bandits and outlaws, the gunslingers of the Old West, Jesse James, Billy the Kid, those kinds of guys whose stories have become so sensationalized over the years it's hard to tell the difference between truth and legend. So even though they were definitely, bad guys that you wouldn't want to run into in a dark alley or anything, the newspapers just reveled in their adventures and sometimes even painted them as a hero, people that are fighting against the system and killing to stay alive and to square bad deals. Serial killers, that was another thing. That's not some hero trying to, buck the system or something. That is a sadistic bastard who gets off on murdering women and small children. That's somebody punching down, not punching up. So serial killers get sensationalized in a different way, focusing on the grotesque and the perverted and the macabre. What can you say? It sells. And this was a lesson the press learned over 100 years ago with the first real serial killer in the United States, the American Ripper himself, H.H. Holmes. All right, so here's the deal with this video. This video is sort of like a collaboration with myself. Collabing with myself. When researching this video, my fellow writer Ryan, who's done a fantastic job helping me out with this channel, he researched the heck out of this video and he found so much detail that we couldn't possibly fit into a video. So what we did was we created a huge blog post out of that. So if you want to get more detail on this story, if this video just kind of like whets your appetite and you want to get all the craziness involved, you can follow the link that's down in the description. It'll take you and you can find out so much more. Sicko. And by the way, before you guys start asking in the comments, yes, this is at answerswithjoe.com/shirts. I don't really wear my branded stuff on here very often, but none of the science-y stuff really had much to do with serial killing. I don't carry serial killer shirts. So if you like this and you want to represent, have at it. All right, so let's start with the legend of H.H. Holmes and work our way backwards. H.H. Holmes was a businessman and small-time hustler in Chicago in the 1890s who had a 3-story hotel at the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets. It was a modest business, but the legend says that this was just a front. What he was really doing was creating a killing factory. He modified the room so that he could pump gas into the rooms to knock out his victims, and then he would dump them down secret chutes down to the basement where he would have them dismembered and disposed of. Sometimes he would drop bodies down that chute unconscious but still alive, so when the victim woke up, they were tied to a table where he would torture them for days before finishing them off. And he installed all this just before the Chicago World Columbian Exposition of 1893, when millions of people came and visited Chicago from all around the world. These were his perfect victims. People were much less connected back then. You couldn't trace people from their credit card purchases or their cell phone activity. Sometimes people just disappeared. And that's exactly what happened in Holmes' House of Horrors. People would check in and then vanish in the middle of the night. Never heard from again. And when the police finally caught on and searched this hotel, they found the burned bodies of hundreds of victims in the basement. Bodies in vats of acid, and an overall just absolute horror show. And Holmes became known as the American Ripper, the Devil of Chicago, and America's first serial killer. Yeah, that's the legend. It's pretty dramatic. The truth is way more convoluted and messy. He was much less of a monster and much more Walter White. But only in the bad ways, like the small-time hustler that was just smart enough to always kind of slither out of trouble, not the badass, say my name, Walter White. First of all, H.H. Holmes wasn't his real name. His real name was Herman Webster Mudgett. Herman was born in 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, and though the legend says that he grew up torturing animals, his mother said that he actually loved animals, especially dogs. Another part of the legend is that Holmes grew up really awkward and couldn't look people in the eye, but the truth was he had something called a strabismus in his left eye, which causes a loss of muscle control. In fact, he was a charming conversationalist by most accounts. He married 3 women throughout his life. He was a compulsive womanizer, so, probably wasn't that awkward. He trained as a surgeon before he moved to Chicago in 1886, where he made his fortune running small con jobs around town, like renting out furniture and bikes under an assumed name and then selling them. And it was while running these small con jobs that he took on the pseudonym H.H. Holmes. When he spelled it out, he would sometimes say Henry Howard or just Harry H. Holmes. Having a fake name kind of helped him to skip out on bills. Holmes eventually scammed enough money that he was able to buy a drugstore in the Chicago neighborhood of Inglewood. The legend has it that he murdered the owners, but he probably just bought it. And across the street from that drugstore, he built a building that would later be known as the Murder Castle. And not because it was a castle for a bunch of crows. Murder of crows. Call them, a group of crows is called a murder of crows. It's a joke. The second floor of this building contained a baffling maze of hallways and rooms, doors that led nowhere, secret walls that opened up into secret rooms, and people later assumed that this was to confuse his victims so he could murder them outside of prying eyes. In fact, the rooms were given names like the Room of Three Corpses and the Asphyxiation Chamber by the press. But it was probably just meant to confuse repo men. It was a place where he could hide all of his furniture and bikes that he was later selling so that nobody could find them. In fact, one of the tenants of the building once said that he saw rooms full of furniture that were just empty the next day. And the whole thing about the hundreds of victims that came from the World's Fair, apparently he didn't take in a single guest from the World's Fair. In fact, while the World's Fair was going on, he was actually living in a different part of town and only visited that building because there was a fire on the third floor, which was probably an insurance scam. And this is actually the pattern with Holmes. He was much less of a genocidal monster and more of just a con man that was constantly juggling his scams. Which might not sound so bad, you know, just a guy running some cons, a little scammer, bit of a shyster, you might say. I mean, it's not like he killed people, except he totally killed people. Like everything about H.H. Holmes, a number of his victims is wrapped up in legend and outright lies, some of which he told himself. He had a great sense about how to confuse people by telling the truth and lying at different times. But there are 9 victims that are canonical and definitely assumed to be from H.H. Holmes, 5 of which happened in the Murder Castle. But the murder that did Holmes in was a guy named Benjamin Petezel. He was actually an accomplice of Holmes, and they went in together on an insurance fraud scam. So what they were going to do was find a dead body and then fake Benjamin's death by passing off the dead body as his, and then collect the insurance money from it and give it to a widow that only appeared on paper, and of course it would go to Holmes, and he would split the money with Benjamin. Now, getting a dead body wasn't difficult for Holmes because he had some medical connections, but he decided that the best way to pass off a dead body as Benjamin Petezel's body would be for it to, you know, actually be Benjamin Petezel's body. So, he killed him. Which had the added bonus of not having to split the money with anybody, so win-win. But in this case, the insurance company challenged the story that Benjamin was blown up in an accidental explosion. They investigated, and they wound up convicting Holmes of this murder, and he was hanged just 9 days before his 35th birthday. But when investigating Holmes, more murders and mysterious disappearances came to light, and a past that was full of manipulation and deception. The first victim that was definitely Holmes' work was a woman named Julia Connor. She worked at Holmes' drugstore in the jewelry department with her husband Ned, who was the jeweler, and he sometimes managed the store for Holmes. And the couple actually lived at Holmes' castle, and somewhere along the way, Julia and H.H. Holmes had an affair. This broke up their marriage. Ned ran away, leaving Julia there with her 6-year-old daughter Pearl. Now, by all accounts, Julia and Pearl were perfectly happy there, but around Christmas of 1891, they both disappeared. The castle's janitor, a guy named Pat Quinlan, had apparently told his family that they had moved off to California, but Pat was also known to be an accomplice of Holmes, so he might have been directed to say that. Regardless, after Holmes was arrested and police started looking through the castle, they actually dug up the remains of a 6-year-old girl in the basement. Holmes would later claim responsibility for Julia's death, but what he claimed was that he was trying to perform an abortion on her and she died on the operating table. Obviously, nobody knows what really happened. Why Pearl was killed is anybody's guess. Maybe she witnessed her mom's death, maybe she was just a responsibility he didn't want to keep up with. But regardless, after a few weeks after they disappeared, he was actually renting out their room for other people, and it still had all their stuff in it. Yeah, according to the tenant that moved in, the room had women's clothes strewn all about, and apparently H.H. Holmes casually kicked a doll under the bed. The next murder attributed to Holmes was a woman named Emmeline Segrand. Just like Julia, she also worked for Holmes and eventually had a romantic relationship with him. Hey ladies, don't date this guy. When she disappeared in 1892, Holmes claimed that she had run off to get married. But one of the tenants of the hotel claimed the day after she was last seen, Holmes and Pat Quinlan were seen carrying out a large crate. He would later claim responsibility for her death, but he used the same excuse that he used for Julia, that she died in a botched abortion attempt. Set side by side, the murders of Julia, Pearl, and Emmeline look less like some sadistic killer that gets off on hurting people and more like somebody that just is a narcissist trying to get rid of his obligations. A narcissist with zero empathy, which is basically a psychopath. There are two more people who Holmes killed in his murder castle, a pair of sisters named Winnie and Nanny Williams, and these are kind of the most mysterious of all of his victims. Holmes had a gift for confusing things by sometimes confessing to crimes that he hadn't committed and denying crimes that he very clearly committed. And even though he very clearly killed Minnie and Nanny, he never claimed responsibility for it. According to his story, Minnie was actually a murderer. She and him were having an affair, and when Nanny came over, she flew into a jealous rage, hit Nanny over the head with a stool, and killed her. Holmes then helped her dispose of the body and then helped her to leave the country, according to Holmes. But both sisters disappeared at the exact same time. They were last seen on July 5th, 1893, and in the days that followed, Holmes made several purchases in Winnie's name, all of which, he made money on. So, he killed her. At this point, Holmes had a pretty impressive body count going, but believe it or not, we're not even at the crazy part yet. Because something I didn't mention before was that Holmes actually had two wives with two separate families while he was living in Chicago, and in 1894, things started getting a little hot around all of his insurance scams, so he had to leave them behind. He went from Chicago to Denver, where he collected some debt that was owed to Minnie Williams, and while he was there, he got married. Again. 3 marriages going on at this point. This one was named Georgiana Yoke, and she actually followed him from Denver to Fort Worth, where he got into trouble for stealing horses. Really, dude? He was chased out of town pretty quickly and learned the meaning of the phrase, "Don't mess with Texas." He bounced to St. Louis, where he had a chance to start a new drugstore business, but decided, hey, it's much better to just rip off your suppliers instead. But his old Chicago hustles didn't work out so well in St. Louis, so he was arrested and put in jail for a brief period of time, where he just couldn't help but brag to his cellmate about all of the insurance scams he was running. After he made bail, he rushed off to Philadelphia, now low on cash and desperate for a payday, and this is where he met up with his old friend, Ben Petzel. Remember Ben, the guy that was going to work with Holmes to fake his own death, and then Holmes just killed him? That's where this happened. Knocked him out with chloroform, then burned his body. But it actually gets way worse than this, because Ben actually had a wife and family. His wife's name was Carrie. He had a daughter named Alice that was 15, a daughter named Nellie that was 12, and a son named Howard that was 8. Carrie and possibly the children knew that there was this insurance scam going on, so when they identified the body, they thought it was the fake dead body. They had no idea that it was actually their father and husband. The insurance company cut Holmes a check for $10,000, and then he told Carrie that he would reunite her with Ben, but he didn't think that the kids should go along with him. He didn't think that they should get wrapped up in this scam, so he put them under the protection of a friend of his named Minnie Williams. Yeah, that Minnie Williams, who had been dead for a year at that point. What he actually did was move these kids around himself. He kept them separate from their mother while he shuttled them all around the country on a wild goose chase. Also, his wife Georgiana was with him, and she had no idea about any of this other stuff, so somehow he shuffled these people around on this insane route from Philly to Cincinnati to Indianapolis to Detroit, with stops in Toronto and Ogdensburg, New York. 3 different groups of people, none of which had any idea that the other people were involved in all this. Sometimes they were riding the same trains and even staying in the same hotels. Eventually, the children became too much for him to want to deal with, so he did what pretty much came naturally to him at this point. It's believed that Howard, the 8-year-old, was poisoned and then burned. Apparently, some of his teeth and chunks of his skull were found in the flue of a stove in a house that Holmes had rented along the way. And the bodies of Alice and Nellie were found buried in a shallow basement. Amazingly, during all this, he had time to go back to his hometown and visit his first wife, Clara, and his son, Robbie. And he told them that he had been in a railway accident and had been experiencing amnesia for the last 6 years. And they were so happy to see him, they were totally fine with the fact that he said that he married Georgiana because she was a nurse that was taking care of him. I mean, this guy. But Holmes's luck finally ran out. The insurance company that dealt with Ben Petzel's death challenged the original story. They hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency, who found a slew, just an entire trail of fraud and scam victims along the way, as well as a former cellmate that shared with them everything that Holmes had bragged about when he was in jail. From November 1894 to July 1895, fragments of the truth started popping up left and right, and Holmes was arrested extradited to Philadelphia, where he faced charges for the murder of Ben Petezel. And all the craziness that they found in the Chicago castle started to come to light after an excavation order was done in July of 1895. Very quickly, the trickle of press interest turned into an absolute flood. Everything got blown completely out of proportion. Details became big mountains of evidence. Ashes that were found in the basement turned into hundreds of bodies. And in fact, they called one room the hanging room because they found a rope in it. Crowds flocked to the murder castle to see the place where all this stuff happened. In fact, in one day, 4,900 people showed up and had to be kept away by the police. But hundreds actually got into the castle and ransacked the place. But even after the Petezel children's bodies were found, the lawyer for H.H. Holmes convinced the judge to only let the evidence around Ben Petezel's death be involved in the case. 12 jurors convicted Holmes of killing Ben. All of his appeals were denied. And even as he was standing at the gallows, the only deaths he claimed responsibility for were Julia and Emmeline's from the botched surgeries. After his execution, the story and the legend of H.H. Holmes just spread even more. Hundreds of people were claimed to have been his victims from the World's Fair, when in fact probably hundreds of people just disappeared, because people just disappeared back then sometimes. Some people claimed Holmes faked his own death, and later on some actually said that he might have been Jack the Ripper before he moved to Chicago. One of the people who actually believes the Ripper story is Jeff Mudgett, the great-great-great-grandson of H.H. Holmes. And he actually had Holmes's body unearthed and did DNA tests on it to make sure that that was actually his body. It was. And by the way, this wasn't easy to do because Holmes insisted that a concrete dome be built over his grave so that people wouldn't desecrate it. Holmes today is remembered more for the crimes that he might have committed than the crimes that he actually committed, which is a shame because these are real people whose lives were destroyed, like dozens of them when you count the family members and everything. That's enough, isn't it? Holmes wasn't a supervillain, though it makes us feel better to think of him that way. If we can think of him as some supernaturally evil person, then we can convince ourselves that we're nothing like him. Labels kind of create a little bit of a distance there. He was a man who told lies with every other breath, who hated earning an honest buck when a crooked one would do, and he thought he was smarter than everybody, and that he would always get away with it. And like everybody else, he started small. Clara Lovering Mudgett, his first and only legal wife, once said to a criminologist that she had a hard time accepting that he did these things, saying, quote, "But of course he has worked himself up to it little by little, and I think, having done some little wrong, he had been driven to a greater one for a cover, and each one growing worse. Of course, it's more easy to go in the wrong after the first few steps." Regardless if he was more Walter White than Zodiac Killer, H.H. Holmes was the first serial killer to really capture the public consciousness. Sadly, he was not the last. As I said at the beginning of this video, there is a blog post with much more detail on all of this that's linked down in the description. I invite you to go check it out if you want more details, but tell me what you think. Do you think that H.H. Holmes was the supervillain? Did he have a murder castle? Did he murder hundreds of people? Was he Jack the Ripper? Tell me what you think in the comments. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. This is a little bit different from the kind of stuff that I normally do. I'm kind of liking to do the biography type stuff. This is definitely in a dark direction, but tell me what you think. All right, thanks for watching, you guys. Please do like and share this video if you liked it. And if this is your first time here, maybe check out this video. I do videos on more science-related topics and futurism. Every once in a while I delve into some dark stuff, because we're dark people sometimes. But if you check out some of my other videos and you like them, I do invite you to subscribe. I come back with videos every Monday and every Thursday. All right, with that, I'm gonna let you go. Sleep tight, everyone, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care.